Welcome to The Thing About Witch Hunts. I'm Josh Hutchinson. Today we speak with Sarah Stewart, president of Partnership of Historic Bostons, about 17th century New England. In particular, we focus on Metacom's resistance, aka King Philip's War, and the importance of understanding Indigenous perspectives on the conflict. And joining us, of course, is my fellow host, Sarah Jack.
Welcome to the Thing About Witch Hunt podcast, Sarah Stewart of Partnership Historic Bostons. Tell us about yourself and your work.
So I'm currently president of the Partnership of Historic Bostons, and we are a public history organization. I am not a historian. I actually lived in England for 30 years, and I have a background working in communications for an aid agency, which meant I traveled to Latin America and India and the West Bank and so forth, doing communication. So I moved to New England and became fascinated by its history. And there you go. It all started then about 10 years ago. So the Partnership of Historic Bostons has been around for a very long time, actually since 1999. And it began as kind of a sister city project between Boston, Lincolnshire, and the northeast of England, and Boston, Massachusetts. So there were trips back and forth. Delegations, mayors from Lincolnshire would come here and be wined and dined and so forth. And it was a very local operation, local people there, local people here. And then it gradually began to turn into a group. When I joined it, it was about really looking at the Puritans on their own terms and trying to tackle a lot of the mythology around the Puritans, which is something you're probably familiar with. So because of the witchcraft mythology is so profound. So so that's the kind of history of the organization. We've taken it in a new direction. Just in terms of the partnership, I should redefine it. I would say we are the only public history organization in New England that focuses only on the 17th century. Sometimes we diverge because there are issues like slavery that go obviously into the 19th century and beyond. But now, instead of just looking at Puritans, we tell everyone's story, whether or not they're Scottish prisoners of war whose indentures were sold by Oliver Cromwell to people in Massachusetts, or enslaved Africans who came over in 1638, the first written record of African enslaved people coming. In John Winthrop's diary, we talk about the Puritans themselves and their English and the context out of which they came in England, and most recently, Indigenous people and Indigenous history in, in New England. So that's what we do. We believe that history really is for everyone. You do not need a PhD. You do not need a degree in history. Anyone can come to terms with the history of where we are today. So
That's fantastic. We love history so much. We absolutely love learning about Boston and its background. And the 17th century is pretty much where we live most of the time with our witch trials, anyways. So we have a lot in common with your organization wanting to spread 17th century Massachusetts history.
yes. Mhm.
What kind of programming does Partnership of Historic Bostons offer?
Well, we've done a little bit of everything. I mean, we are truly eclectic. Before the pandemic, we had a book club or a book group that met at the Massachusetts Historical Society. People would read primary documents and then come and discuss them, or we would have authors come and present their books. And we hosted lectures under a theme every fall. Now we are online. Mainly, we do online events. And we cover everything from music and musicians during the English Civil War to a conspiracy theory about Hugh Peter, who was a Salem minister who went back to England and fought and was Cromwell's chaplain and was later executed. And most recently, as we'll discuss, we've done a series on King Philip's War. So there's a little bit of everything. And I think it's our attempt to understand how people lived mingled lives. Because a weakness has been, and this is true for, I think, all New England historical societies, and historians are trying to grapple with this. And so you have Indigenous people on one side, African enslaved people over here, and then Puritans over here. But no. They were in and out of each other's houses. Enslaved people lived in the homes of Puritans. John Winthrop, in the early days, before things went very badly wrong, had Indigenous leaders to dinner at his house. So there's a much more of a mixed existence than is commonly recognized. And we all, of course, I just want to say one thing about the Puritans and mythology, which is most people in New England still, most people in the world, I think, still think the Puritans were just about big black hats and executing witches, hanging witches, and hating Christmas. And they did execute witches and they did hate Christmas, but nobody really asked why or puts it in context. So we want to say also, they have to compare the witch trials to what happened in Europe and Scotland and to really look at, how they were a product of the Reformation in Europe and in the English Reformation as well. And I think finally, just on the Puritans, I have to defend them. People, by focusing on the black hats and Salem and so forth, sometimes people don't recognize what they did bring, which was the rights we are fighting for today. Secret ballots, accountable government, to some degree, just only some degree, as you know, separation of church and state, a sense of, being against tyranny. They left because of what they saw as tyranny in England. And they actually broadened the franchise when they arrived. And you also had things like the first protests, taxation, no taxation without representation. And finally, I would say about what to learn from the Puritans is they had a sense of community, that their idea of liberty and freedom had to do with the community good in a way that we don't understand today, much less individualistic. And those are all things that we need to know and understand and see. These are the root, these go back to the 1630s or 1620s, some people would say. So,
Yeah. And another aspect of the community you're building is that it's a two-way conversation because you have memberships and with your programming, you give opportunities for questions and engagement, and you do book clubs with discussion, and you collect a lot of feedback. Can you tell us about how important that is to what you're doing?
absolutely essential. I mean, the more we can build a community, the better. Because every time, I mean, I don't run the book club. My colleague Ivana Tamayo does. But every time I'm in those discussions, I learn so much because people who come to this, whether or not they have a background in the subject, have so much to say that, we all learn from each other and we're all kind of in a joint venture to understand better the past here and what it means today. So, and people are generally very thoughtful and considered. So, yeah, we get a lot out of it. We hope they do too. So, and we always survey our members to see, what do they want? What do they want to see coming up? What do they think? Did it go well? Did it not go well? That sort of thing.
You
And
recently had a major program. There's a big piece of history that we've talked about a little bit on our show because the Salem witch trials were influenced a little bit by King Philip's War.
Mm.
But the King Philip's War story is so much bigger than the witch trials. It involves so many more people, so many more deaths, unfortunately, and just devastation. What would you like to tell us about that program and why Historic Boston's thought it was important to offer?
I think a couple of things. One is it's an unknown war for the most part. People don't know anything about it. People who are born and raised here don't know anything about it. Or if they do, they think of histories that were influenced by the Puritan writers at the time, Increase Mather and so forth, who wrote it from their point of view, obviously, or the captivity narrative, such as that by Mary Rowlandson, who told the story of she was captured with members of her family and taken away and then redeemed later for a ransom, I think £20 sterling. So that's been, if anyone knows about King Philip's War, and there are very few people who do, that's their understanding. So we wanted to both say this was a war, the bloodiest war per capita in American history, fundamentally important in shaping the lives of colonists, certainly, because they saw their villages destroyed and had to flee and so forth. And more fundamentally for Indigenous people, because their sovereignty was basically in southern New England, they lost almost entirely. They lost their sovereignty, their land, their lives, their villages, their homelands. They lost everything. And that paved the way for the revolution. It paved the way for Western expansion. It, some people say it was a blueprint for what happened to Indigenous people across the country. So, yeah. So it's the fundamental nature of this war, as well as the fact that nobody knew anything about it, is what led us to look at it.
And it's the 350th anniversary of this. While a lot of us are looking at and reflecting on the 250th anniversary of
Mhm.
America, this is a significant anniversary too.
Yes, yes, yes. The 250 is totally important and has Puritan roots. There's no question about that, because you can see it in the writings, John Adams and all the rest of them. But the King Philip's War really altered the entire shape of New England. Never went back. And so I think to understand that fundamental shift was the purpose of our series.
And you touched on this a bit with talking about the Puritan writers at the time,
Mhm.
but how has that popular history, the way that it's been known up until recently, how have we learned that history?
I've talked to a lot of people who were born and raised here. They say they write to us and say things like, "I went to school to an excellent school in Massachusetts, Connecticut, wherever, and I'd never heard about it." Or generally, people don't know anything about it. Or if they do, they think of King Philip, who was actually that was the English name for Metacomet, who was a Pokanoket Wampanoag Sachem, and who did rally Indigenous tribes to fight back. He did form a resistance, but it was a much larger thing than a single individual. So it's either people know nothing about it, or it's told from the point of view of one individual, and when he died, the war was over, which is also not the case. Or more in a more basic way, what you see in the monuments and markers all over New England are markers that say the colonists were victorious. They named the colonial members of the colonial militia. They talk about their courage and their valor in defending their whatever families and villages. And then Native people are completely anonymous. In fact, we did a whole focus on Turner's Falls, which is where a big massacre took place. And the memorial there's a monument to Captain William Turner and his courageous men who destroyed 300 Indians. That's the word they use. And it actually turns out that the 300 Native people were elders, children, women, refugees who had been fleeing the fighting elsewhere and had encamped there. So they were we just we wanted to go deeper into this to see it in another way, because so much of history is told as you drive by the signs or you go into a museum, a local museum. That's what you'll see: victorious William Turner versus nameless Indians who started to fight for no apparent reason, wanton savages. So
Which is it's a lie. That's a
mhm.
lie. And
Yes.
you one of the ways that Partnership Boston's is helping us relearn this history was through this wonderful lineup of talks and presentations, and they all have different ways of looking at the story.
So we set out with the Metacom's resistance to look at what, first of all, why are we calling it resistance as opposed to King Philip's War? To try to understand the reasons behind it and to sort of turn the traditional narrative upside down. So we were pretty unabashed about that. We were not taking the colonial point of view particularly. We wanted to see the other side, because if people know about King Philip's War, as I said, they know the colonial view. And so we began with a very basic kind of King Philip's War 101, given by a really fantastic, knowledgeable, eloquent grad student at Boston College, Kevin March. And if anybody needs the basic primer, what is KPW? This is the one. Watch his presentation. It's on our website, and perhaps you'll put it in in your notes,
Yes.
people. So it's a very basic background, and the fact that we had 900 people watched. That was as of last month. 900 people had watched the recording of it, and something like 800 people logged on. Shows just how much people really want to know. So from there, we had a basic background, and then we started to go into more detail, first with a panel discussion that looked at why, how is it that what we might think of as being part of the, a quaint colonial past where they wore the black hats and silver buckle shoes, and how for Native people, that is not the past. That is very much today. And we can talk about that some more. Some to look at how it's present now for Indigenous people, but also really should be for us as well. And then we went into more detail about the different aspects of King Philip's War that people aren't really aware of. The enslavement of Indigenous people, that at least 1,000, maybe 2,000 people, Indigenous people, were captured and enslaved. We held a book club where we looked at one of the captivity narratives, but also somebody, William Apis, who was a 19th century Pequot minister who wrote another view of King Philip's War. And then we looked at Turner's Falls, the example I just gave, where, well, we can talk about this more, but we want to go in detail about one example of how you can understand history differently. And then we had a final panel discussion just last week looking at the legacy of King Philip's War and how tribal peoples survived, thrived even, and are still here.
Right. The demand for this information, like you pointed out, is there because it's skipped over in schools. I didn't go to school in Massachusetts, so I never heard about King Philip's War, even the probably the name of it, until at least college, maybe after college, started to learn about this. And of course, it's the colonial view that's been shared. Since then, I've been able to read several books about it, but for the average person who's just getting introduced to this, I think the talk with Kevin March was rather brilliant
Mm-hmm.
and very informative. I learned so much from that.
Mm-hmm. We hope to bring him back to talk about the war in northern New England, because it doesn't end when Philip is killed in 1676. It continues with a very different outcome in the north. The colonists were weaker, the Abenaki were stronger. So we'll get him back on that.
Yeah, we talk a little bit about that on our programming because some of the afflicted people in the Salem witch trials were Maine refugees, and particularly Mercy Lewis, her extended family died in King Philip's War in the extended northern part of it that is even less known
Mm-hmm.
than the southern part.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
I found it really significant that you had a panel right after Kevin's presentation. You brought in individuals representing their culture and their citizenship and their tribes and their nations to talk from the Indigenous perspective about the colonial perspective, but their experiences. And I was just so grateful as I listened to this panel that I was hearing from these voices. What kind of response and how did that keep things moving forward for the program?
I mean, I think we actually wanted to start with that, but we had to change it because somebody was away. And maybe in retrospect, it was better to have just the practical, like, what are we talking about before going into how do we understand it? But I mean, I think it's actually, it put the Indigenous view front and center because they were all so eloquent, so knowledgeable, so informed. And to shift your point of view on history is a hard thing to do, especially something you're just trying to figure out. Or if you were raised and you read children's books based on a captivity narrative, I mean, it's very hard to resist that pull. The very idea that something from 350 years ago would still be very present in the minds and hearts of people today is a new one. So I think, and it would be one thing we could say that, but does not have the same meaning as people speaking for themselves.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And they all had different points of view and they all work so wonderfully together, building a picture. I think people were very moved by it. And I think someone wrote that they went to the panel thinking they would learn more kind of facts about the war, but they came away with a much greater understanding and a way of approaching, of asking questions differently for the future. That was a pretty wonderful result.
Yeah, I felt, really moved and just it opened my eyes to a lot of, how do people feel about this happening to their ancestors?
Yeah. I think Brittany Wally, who is a Hassanaமிஸ்கோ monk and so eloquent, but she talked about how time was kind of accordioned so that, it was 350 years ago, but all of a sudden it just comes right bang into the present for them. And, and I would say it should for all of us. As we look around the landscape, it's all still here. This would have been all native land or our mingled communities. And the war put an end to that pretty much. Yeah. Just to come to your point, Josh, I think that when we read Mary Rowlandson's captivity narrative for the book club, um, it's clear that colonists suffered unbelievably. I mean, the terror, fear that fueled the Salem witchcraft, the violence. I mean, there's no disputing that. It was, I think, as somebody put it in the book club who had actually been in Vietnam, this was a total war. No one was left untouched. No one. Even Boston's, I was going to put up some kind of palisade to protect itself. Whole towns were destroyed. So there's no disputing the level of violence, the personal nature of it, basically hand to hand combat and scalpings and the killing of small children and 300 people being killed at Turner's Falls. I think we have to see it as all civilians suffered enormously on both sides.
I am just learning so much, and there's so much context that I need to continue to understand better. But from my work on the witchcraft fear and trials, and
Mhm.
from some of what Trisha Pion had shared in her presentation from Increased Writings and others, and then of course what we've read from ministers and other pamphlets, this aspect of the colonial belief that they were chosen, that this was to be their land, and this demonization, this fear of the devil, this rooting out evil, it played out in this horrific, violent physical war. Like, if you took out that aspect, that fear of the devil and that right that they were taking for themselves of life, it's just incredible to me how destructive that belief system was to the
Absolutely.
lives, to everyone's lives.
Everyone, yes, everyone. The assumption of inequality, the assumption of the rightness of their ways, the assumption of God on their side, all of that fueled it, made all this possible. There's no question about it. Yeah. We are having, I'm going to have, but just so you know, Dan Richter is going to be talking about that very same topic in September. He's a
Oh,
fantastic
exciting.
historian. Yeah. So,
Good,
yes,
good.
if they hadn't believed in the kind of, it was a sort of hegemonic view of the rightness of their ways and that God was on their side. There were differences. A lot, including Increased Mather, believed that the war was a punishment from God for their sins. So that played into it too. But that does not mean that Indigenous people were not just seen as heathens and savages, agents of the devil. And the more the violence went on, the worse, of course, that became. And you see that trajectory also in the captivity narrative. So you start with Mary Rowlandson, and she's actually does reveal how she was kept alive, even though all the Native people were starving. I mean, literally starving, and how they treated her with respect, how they treated her, they gave her a Bible to read. Somebody gave her a Bible. They paid her money for work she did, tailoring and other tasks, and she was redeemed. But she could never see that this showed an equality or an equal humanity. She couldn't bring herself to see that. Yeah. And then Of course, it's very revealing. Captives taken by native people were redeemed for money. Captives taken by the colonists were enslaved and either placed in households in New England or sent to the Caribbean or as far away as Tangier, the Azores, and elsewhere.
Mm.
There's a Wampanoag community in St. David's Island, which I think is Bermuda, still today.
Oh, that's fascinating. I was going to ask, were people able to make it back to Massachusetts? Were they ever released from slavery, or did they just
Very
live and
few,
die where they were sent?
very, very few ever return. But I mean, if
So
they were
sad.
sent into slavery in the Caribbean, how could they survive? You know, Jamaica, for instance, had, maybe this was a little bit later, but Jamaica estimated that it was cheaper to keep importing people from Africa than to enable them to live longer than 10 years. So it was a charnel house. The
Yeah.
chances of survival were really small.
Yes.
Yeah.
Looking at the story of the enslavement that was part of this conflict helps us to recognize the commodification. They spoke to that during the panel. I was, again, so grateful to hear that come forward because we do, as modern Americans, understand that word and what it means because we live it now. Everything is about that. What's a commodity and the foot forward and up and looking at how the invasion of that mentality was a part of what was a barrier to the commingling.
Absolutely. I mean, I think Elizabeth Solomon from is Massachusetts at Ponkapock spoke to that particularly, but the idea of private property and land, a very foreign idea. Of course, Native people did buy and sell land or maybe sold land inside the deeds and so forth, but that was often with an understanding that you would carry on using the land. It wasn't commodification in the way that we know it. It wasn't early capitalism, certainly their understanding. So, or mercantilism more accurately. Yeah. So that was their fundamental differences. And you see that in the very beginning of the colonial existence here in the early 1630s. The colonists bring cattle and pigs and so forth, and they run riot through cornfields, native cornfields. And in the beginning, the Massachusetts Bay Company minutes show native people coming in and complaining and getting some kind of compensation. And the colonists are told, put your cow into, fence it, please. That's, unique. And that begins to change. And pretty soon it's all about the property of the colonists and disregarding the cornfields of the native people.
And
They, yeah.
yeah, that land ownership is so important to the English. It's all the king's land ultimately, but
Mm-hmm.
he's granted parts of it. And there's so much speculation in land on the northern frontier and elsewhere in New England.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they're just gobbling it up.
Yeah. In the same minutes, you see quite often, well, John Winthrop deserves another 500 acres here, or so and so deserves another 200 acres there. So, what gives them the right is, as you were saying, Sarah, it's a little hard to understand that, but they felt absolutely entitled.
Right. Increased Mather saying that, you know, the indigenous people were trying to dispossess the English of the lands that God gave to the English.
Yeah.
It's really, yeah, that takes some nerve.
It does. But if you don't see people as fundamentally equal, then that's what happens. And
Right.
you think God is on your side, then, that's what happens. Yeah. I think, the other thing they wanted to say in the panel, particularly Elizabeth Solomon again, was, we need to maybe look at the land differently now and treat it well. And there are lessons to be learned today from the difference in understanding of land as a commodity or land as part of all of us.
Yeah, there were lots of parts of that conversation that I was like, "Oh, this is a 2-hour discussion in itself, and we've got to come back to that. But
Mhm.
one way to get back to those important topics is to look for Indigenous writers, who's publishing books, what programming is happening, and keep amplifying voices and finding those voices and listening to them.
Yep. Yeah. Yes, definitely. I mean, there is so much exciting scholarship happening now. So much. Not enough, but so much. Not, I mean, obviously associated with universities, but also just tribal preservation historic officers. And the tribes themselves are a wonderful resource, and independent scholars like Paula Peters, who's Mashpee Wampanoag, has written a book. Yeah, people should be we should be reading those books. It should, yeah. And there is a really fantastic scholarship. And somebody like Brad Lopes, who was in that first panel, he's Aquina Wampanoag. He is an eloquent, unbelievably knowledgeable speaker. I heard him on Sunday talking about an overview of King Philip's War, but he'll be back to speak for us, I hope, in the spring about continuing that topic of erasure, about how the early Puritan writings erased any validity or any voice for Indigenous people and turned the whole thing into, as Josh says, it's the colonists were being persecuted, not the other way around. So, yeah, I would say to your audience, if you can possibly go hear people in person, if you can go to a powwow because we're being welcomed to come, then do it. And if you can get some of the readings, do that too. We have a long list of sources on our website. I can send you the link for that.
Thank you. Yeah, your organization just does such a great job of giving resources to sources of reading material and access to information and knowledge.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
success that you have. And there's a lot of important work where organizations are trying to rebirth themselves into a better way of teaching and looking at history. But you guys are really an example. And you're mentoring us all
Oh,
on
thank
coming
you.
together and talking and learning together. And that's part of it because your attendees are going to leave and talk to their communities, their family members, their classrooms, their church members, their neighbors maybe. And that is a really that's something that can't be stopped. So, as long as we keep giving it opportunities for people to learn like this, and what you're offering, the program is just extremely rich, and it's not flat. It is you walk away. When we presented with Emerson Baker this fall, that opportunity, even getting to see how the members and attendees interacted with us in the question, we walked away from that empowered to do a better job. And I really am really excited about the work, but I just really want to express that it is life changing, it's mind changing, and
That's what we hope. But can I just say there are other organizations doing this, doing fantastic work. And I feel I like we've had fantastic feedback on this series. The credit really needs to go to the speakers. They were so amazing. Were you able to watch the last panel discussion last week?
not yet.
You watched that. It was unbelievable. Thoughtful. They spent ages, obviously, preparing, but everyone had some so important. It was actually, this is a trite word, but true, was really profound. It was really meaningful. And so looking at the legacy of King Philip's War, how that is experienced today, how people survived it, held on to their culture, live it today, it was really amazing. So we owe it to them. All of them were just superb. So, but I would say, it's a challenge trying to marry Puritan history and non-Puritan history. The scholarship doesn't lend itself to that very easily because people tend to work in isolation. So this is something that we're continuing to work on. So coming up in the autumn, for instance, we have Daniel Richter, who's a very renowned historian of Indigenous history in the United States. And he's being moderated by Brad Lopes, who's the eloquent Aquina Wampanoag citizen. He's an educator. And then we have a panel discussion on stolen relations, which is a project begun quite some years ago, tracking the names and lives of enslaved Indigenous people. And so the Indigenous people and the lead academic on that are going to be in the panel and explaining how to use the website. Who, can you research your relatives and can you find their names and so forth, that sort of thing. But then we're having a symposium on Puritanism, which hardly talks about Indigenous people. So there we have far to go. But I think that the response that we've had from Metacom's resistance as a whole is that people want more. So one comment was, what took you so long? Do more. So that's what we intend to do.
I think it's kind of like what I go through with our material and what we're able to research and talk about with experts or author. It's like this hurry up but slow down because it's what you guys have done. There's layers and layers and layers for us all to pull up and look at, and we have that looking at witch hunting and how it happened and why it happened. And
Yeah.
I'm we do have to keep looking at the colonists, and we do need to keep talking with our Indigenous brothers and sisters and start to see and understand the culture. And I was really struck when they talked about the individual communities and nations that came together with Metacom. They're so individual, and I wanna know more about that. I think how amazing, how complex we are as humans and the individual, these cultures that are together and
Mm-hmm.
family groups and community groups.
Think two things. One is the last panel discussion really does bring that out because the moderator is Gerald Tony Hawley, who's House of Misco at Nipmuc, and she asked each of the panelists questions specific to their tribe. So that came out they had things in common, but everybody has a different, they're not speaking for their tribe, but they're reflecting that point of view. So yeah, I would say we do need to understand the Puritans, and particularly from what you were saying about the great fear that people experienced and how that fueled the witchcraft scare. Every time I drive up to Salem, I look around at the woods and think how terrified people must have been.
Right.
Just
And it's so dark back then, and there's wild animals that aren't there
that
anymore.
constant
And
threat of someone coming out of the forest
uh,
and how, and as you say, everyone was harmed everyone was harmed by this. Yeah. And then the war really cut off possibilities of living in harmony at all. People were basically confined to just many fewer so-called praying Indian towns where they were closeted away, didn't have the right to walk freely, were subject to fines and taxes, so they had to sell their land and confined in smaller and smaller places.
and it wasn't the last war either. The warring just continued
Right.
between the Puritan colonists and the Indigenous peoples. So,
That's right.
yeah.
King William's War, Queen Anne's War, the French and Indian Wars. Yes. The raid on Deerfield is another example of this, all the same dynamics, the fear and how it was memorialized. The Deerfield residents in Deerfield actually kept the enormous fortified wooden door. It was fortified with iron that had a huge hole in the middle where Native people were trying to use an axe to get in. And they kept that as a symbol of their defiance as a town. You can see it in the Memorial Hall Museum today.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's all around us.
I noticed when we were listening to Kevin give the 101 how one perspective is that this court case in this murder was a trigger
Mhm.
to the rising. How else do we see how the colonists' legal system, which was the threads of their beliefs of sovereignty and God and providence and what is a sin is all in it. But how were there other aspects of the court system or punishment that came out in these talks? I was curious about, because we're always in the court with witch hunts. So
Yes, yes, you are definitely. Oh, absolutely. And this changes as over time. As I said, it was once upon a time, Indigenous people could come into Boston and get some recompense for having their cornfields ruined.
right.
Slowly but sure. And because the colonists were not so powerful, they would treat the tribes as equals, or not equal, but as sovereign entities with their own leadership, their own governance structure, and their own legal system. And the treaties that were signed agreed that were an agreement by the colonists that any crimes committed in the tribes were judged in tribes. That lawsuit, that court case, is an example of an Indigenous person being tried for the ostensible murder of another Indigenous person, and it was taken into the colonial courts. So it's a complete and practical ways, you're not going to get a fair trial. But in the bigger picture is Indigenous sovereignty is being, you know, completely ignored. They just ram right through it. And there's a wonderful book by Jenny Pulsifer. I don't know what took me so long to find it. It was published in 2005, I think, called Subjects Under the Same King. And she frames the whole conflict as one over, so much of it is over sovereignty. The Native people, they had entire systems of that guaranteed everything you would want: health, happy families, longevity, much more so. The colonists, they were larger, healthier, all the rest of it. They had diplomatic relations and everything. And the colonists just blew right through all that. So I think that's a really important feature. So I think you're right to raise the legal question, that question of the law courts. And also, they would impose punishments like you will hand over all your guns. No one gave them the right to do that. They assumed that the colonists assumed those rights.
And there were accused witches who in the past had dealt in guns with their Native American neighbors. So that does come up in some of the stories. That was a blemish on the colonists if they'd done that.
How interesting. Yeah, I can imagine. And that was one reason why Thomas Morton, does he figure it all in your research? In the south of Boston, Thomas Morton, who was the man in Marymount who had the
Oh yeah.
maypole, and the rest, they sent him back, and he fumed and wrote against them and so forth. He sold, but he worked collaboratively. He had a very positive view of Native people and their a greater humanity. He argues in his book, a greater humanity than the Puritans.
Yeah, Josh and I did a short episode over on the thing about the Salem witch trials podcast on the maypole on May 1st that week.
Oh,
And that was the most that I had looked at Thomas. And that week I did so much reading into primary sources. The Plymouth colony despised him and he
terrible.
despised them. And so you have, hit both of their tellings of what was happening. They were both of you seeing the same Puritan, type narrative, but he was definitely against that. I would like to spend more time looking
Yeah.
at that.
Yes. I mean, I'm hoping that we can get someone. Peter Moncall has written a really excellent book about Thomas Morton. I'd love to get him to speak for us, because in a way, he is more typically English than the Puritans. He was the master of the revels, which is something that comes from the Inns of Court. He had a maypole, much more kind of popular English cultural elements in his life, and his outrage about the Puritans. And as I recall, I might be wrong about this, but as I recall in the minutes, the Puritans arrive in Salem, then they come down to Charlestown and they have their first formal meeting that's minuted. And in those minutes, they document that they're sending people off to arrest him and put him in chains and arrest him in Marymount and bring him back and then send him back to England. So
Yeah.
one of their first acts.
Yeah.
Wow.
John Endicott. he cuts down the maple.
Oh,
His land is in the center of the Salem witch trials. His descendants are
uh,
complaining and defending accused witches during the Salem witch trials, and, he cut the maple down, he planted this pear tree that's still alive in Salem. There's so much interesting aspects of those early
oh,
stories and
fantastic.
connections.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. He does what he Morton, to me, what shows is there could have been other ways. There were choices that were made. And maybe the Puritans didn't really have a choice given the intensity of their worldview, as Josh was saying, that the land must be ours because the king said so and God has given it to us. Maybe it was not possible for them to do just because they were locked into their way of seeing. But Thomas Morton, I think, does show that there was a possibility of other ways.
Yeah. I think we really need to think about those possibilities because as a lot of the messaging that came out of your series was, there wasn't just one way for this to end, the war. We have been taught that
Yes.
we were just gonna stomp it out,
Yeah.
but it didn't necessarily have to go that
Didn't
way.
have to be. I mean, there are decisions made along the way that lead to this, the outbreak of the war, as you say, with the legal system encroaching increasingly on indigenous sovereignty, forcing people to sell their land, ruining their crops. And then you get to the war. And of course, then you have a scorched earth policy where people are on both sides destroying food crops and sources and people who are starving to death on both sides. So yeah. Yeah. So you have to see it as a series of choices within that larger context of fear and, being enabled by God, being mandated by God to hold this land.
Yeah, and today we would see a lot of that total warfare as just war crimes,
Yes, we would.
harming the civilian population, harming their food supply.
Hmm.
Those things aren't legal under international law.
No, they don't. No, they are happening around the world, though. So
Yeah, we're seeing them.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Did you want me to read you a couple of the responses from viewers?
Sure.
That
I
would be
don't know
great.
if reading will help. So, this is what a couple of people have said. I came with an expectation of learning about Indigenous people and left with the additional lens of what does this history say about white European settlers then, and what does that tell us about us as their descendants now? Yeah, that's a wow. That's people are so thoughtful and so considered. And this is like a lot of personal reflection comes out of this. So another person wrote, I drive around seeing these signs about the so called King Philip's War and yet have very little context for understanding it. I grew up with only one side of the story and not much at that. So I think, and you must find this when you work on witchcraft that people want to know and want to understand and aren't threatened by it.
Right.
And
Yeah.
somebody said, I'm a descendant of Pilgrims and Puritans. I believe in telling the truth. So where, we might have expected some kind of resistance to this, but I think we haven't found that at all. And I think it was sort of, not to be too political, but it is a matter for people, even non-professional historians like us, or like me anyway, that the call from the White House for patriotic history is it's it's really not resonating with people, at least our audience. People and they people want to know. It's that it for the White House, and the executive order attacking the Smithsonian, particularly the Museum of African American History, talked about didn't want to know negative things that put the US in a bad light. But actually, I think that the way to understand the United States and its evolution, you have to look at the whole thing. And I think that's very much what people are saying to us.
Mm.
Yeah, absolutely. When we had our exoneration legislation over in Connecticut in 2023, when it was voted in, at that point, it was an absolution and not an exoneration, which is a whole conversation
Mhm.
terminology. But when it got to the Senate, every senator voted yes, but one, and the one that voted no said, that's a blemish on our history. That's a negative part of our history. That's why he voted no, for this very reason.
I know you feel like saying to them, but is it true?
Exactly. Yeah, the is it true? And I think that's what, I descendants of accused witches and accusers of witches, they start to see the truth when they may be going through their genealogy, and then they find themselves listening to an important presentation by a historian or our podcast or another podcast, and
Mm,
something jumps out of them, out of the record, and it is jolting, because I think there can be some there where the conflict is coming up for people based on what I see comments on our social media is, oh, like, I thought this was such a cool story. Salem, I'm attached to Salem. Wow. But oh, this is what was happening, and my ancestors were a part of this. How do I reconcile that? But
yeah,
people are willing to reconcile it, and they
they
do
are.
that by getting more information. I think it's a really important moment in an American experience
Yeah,
looking at history right
absolutely.
now.
Absolutely. Getting more information, understanding the mindset of people then, understanding the context and what they come out of. And we're not responsible for our ancestors, but we are responsible for looking at the truth.
Right.
So,
And I think we're responsible for learning from people's mistakes.
mm,
And we need to be open to receive both sides of the story and all the information that we can.
but also, I know this is trite, but to say we need to listen to the people whose ancestors were affected and who are still affected today. So that is what gives the power. The speakers, we had three intertribal panel discussions, and they were so powerful and profound. And people were so thoughtful and eloquent. So years and years of scholarship in the archives, and also just thought and processing all this. And we need to listen to this. It is, as I said before, King Philip's War is present for them today, and it should be present for us because it has shaped where we are now. We would love to hear from your audience if they have questions. They should email us at phbostons@gmail.com. We're happy to engage with everyone. And I hope that we can carry on working together. It would be such a pleasure and a joy.
Absolutely. We are so excited about your organization and what you're doing, and it helps us feel less alone in what we're trying to do with witch hunting past and present.
Oh, it's so impressive what you're doing. It is so fantastic. And to look at the past and also look at the worldwide context, it is really a wonderful thing. Yeah. And for the descendants particularly, but just for all of us to know that this can happen in our history. And at this sort of thing. I mean, there are through lines to issues of persecution today as well. So yeah, there's so much we can learn.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you. It's always a pleasure to see you both.
You too. Thank you for joining us today. Please view the show notes for links to the content and books we spoke about. You can find us on YouTube at youtube.com/@aboutwitchhunts, or you can view episodes of our 3 podcasts, The Thing About Witch Hunts, The Thing About the Salem Witch Trials, and Salem Witch Trials Daily. Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.